Welcome to Breakpoint this week, where we're talking about the top stories of the week from a Christian worldview. Today we're going to talk about a new theology book that suggests God has widened his mercy to include people engaged in same-sex behavior. We're also going to talk about the state of free speech around the world and what role the church has to play in that. So we have a lot to get to today. We're so glad you're with us. Stick around. Welcome to Breakpoint this week. From the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, I'm Maria Baer, alongside John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center. This has been a heavy week. First of all, we learned, of course, a couple days ago of the death of 6 hostages that have been held in Gaza since the October 7th attack, including 1 American citizen. Those funerals were held, some of them this past weekend, and the Israeli people, there have been major protests in Tel Aviv, pushing their government to somehow get the release of the rest of the hostages. It's just so you can just feel the mourning in that country is really palpable. And then, of course, today, you and I are recording this a little bit earlier than we typically do in the week. Today's Wednesday. And today there was yet another school shooting. This was at a high school in Georgia, it sounds like. And as far as we know, 4 people have died. They've taken a suspect into custody. We don't know much else than that. But I just feel the heaviness this week.
You don't need to look very far to remember that the world has fallen, and it's also something that undermines some of the most well-meaning but most dangerous ideas, which actually think differently about the human condition. Either a worldview or worldviews that say there's no such thing as good and evil, that's just kind of random and chaotic, that there's no really way to morally assign actions or consequences or anything like that, because it's all just, it is what it is kind of thing. And also those that tend to treat the human condition as if it's perfectible, as if we don't need rescue, as if we can kind of fix ourselves. So in between a nihilism and a humanism are even if well-intended and well-meaning, they end up being things that misunderstand and misrepresent the world. There are these constant reminders of these things. I think it was it Chesterton who said that the fall is the most historically verifiable Christian doctrine that is original sin. And we see that both in the fallenness of people in their actions, and we see it also in a fallenness of a kind of a broken world that clearly too where something's gone wrong. We could start the program. I'm guessing at some level we could start the program each and every week with that little remembrance.
In today's news of the fallen world, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's right.
But maybe this is a helpful way to start the show. It's a good transition into what I did want to speak with you about first off today, which is this new book that has surprised a lot of people by 2 theology professors, Christopher Hayes and Richard Hayes. I believe Richard is the father. Yes.
That's right. And
he has been a professor for many years, a New Testament professor at Duke. And then Chris, his son, is an Old Testament professor at Fuller Seminary. They've written a book that was recently released called The Widening of God's Mercy, in which they surprisingly offer LGBTQ people who identify with that acronym and are actively acting on those same-sex desires or whatever it might be. So we're including the behavior in here. Should be welcomed into God's family and God's church and not called to repentance for those actions. And they don't so much argue it from the standpoint of scripture that, they don't quibble with, for example, what Richard Hayes has written about in the past, that the scriptures that specifically prohibit same-sex activity don't actually say that. That's not what they're arguing. They are arguing that there is a sort of hidden moral arc to the Bible, that the trajectory continues after the Bible was published, and that things have changed, and essentially God has changed his mind. And in our day and age, welcoming people that are engaged in that sort of activity is the same thing as God inviting the Gentiles into what was previously a covenant with the Jewish people. So this has made a lot of waves. I know you've spoken about being an admirer of Richard Hayes in the past. So what do you make of this new book?
Yeah. So years ago, Sean McDowell and I co-authored a book on the topic of same-sex marriage. This was before there was the Obergefell decision, which kind of overturned the will of 30 states, various ballot initiatives where states had defined marriages between a man and a woman. Those were basically turned over by the Obergefell decision. Justice Kennedy wrote that there was a trajectory essentially to our understanding of these issues, both in terms of understanding of same-sex attraction as orientation, but more specifically, that there was a trajectory of kind of justice and tolerance and kindness that the American people were on. That's actually what Justice Kennedy argued, that we were more just and tolerant than people that had come before us. I remember Chief Justice John Roberts, when that decision came out, said, look, if he was one of the dissenters, he said, look, if you are an advocate of same-sex marriage, you should celebrate today, but don't celebrate the Constitution, because this decision wasn't based on the Constitution at all, which was absolutely right. What Richard Hayes and his son have done here in this book is essentially make a similar sort of argument about the Bible. To be clear, it's nothing new. What makes this huge is that Richard Hayes' previous work, as you mentioned, took a very different tack. And then the second thing that is really important is that this is basically two high caliber scholars making this case. The trajectory argument is made on Twitter and on TikTok and on social media by pastors that really just make random statements about inclusivity being the core message of the gospel, and then kind of justifying it without any sort of real take on Scripture. Now, to be clear, some of the reviews of this book, and I'm thinking here of a couple that have appeared in Tom Schreiner, for example, well-respected biblical scholar, basically says that's what's happening here, is that Hayes and his son are not making any sort of biblical case here. They're not saying anything new. But it is just so odd, then why say anything at all? They're not making a scholarly case. And the past kind of proponents of this sort of argument, and basically what you're saying is like, look, remember how, God limited his mercy just to Israel, and then it was expanded to everybody else, and then it was expanded. And, basically there's this trajectory that God is on to include more and more and more and more people. Well, there's a number of problems with that. And it doesn't take really a rocket surgeon, to realize this. First, when it comes to sexual sin, Jesus is not more inclusive. He's less inclusive. When it comes to sexual sin, Jesus takes acts of the flesh and backs the sin up into acts of the heart or intentions of the heart. Adultery then is not just if you actually commit adultery with someone who's not your spouse. It's if you imagine yourself doing it. It's the same thing. So Jesus is turning sin into a heart issue in a way that is not clear in certainly Old Testament law in the past, and he's doing it specifically in the case of sexuality. Second, the promise of including more people than Israel was made from the very beginning when God selected Abram to be the father of Israel. It was always the point. There was not a trajectory. There was a process of unraveling God's plan. But it wasn't like all of a sudden God learning. And that's really the third thing, which is this whole theory is based on the fact that God is growing and God is learning. And just to be clear, that's the sort of populist theological innovation. By the way, that's a really nice way for me to say popular theological nonsense that you hear from quote unquote affirming pastors. And a lot of them, although still embracing the moniker evangelical, have basically said Jesus wasn't sinless. Jesus sinned because he was discriminatory towards other people, and he himself learned. Now, I don't think Hayes would say that. I don't think his son necessarily would say that. But what's so interesting and troubling is that Richard Hayes has written one of the definitive books about New Testament ethics in our lifetimes. His book on the ethical vision of the New Testament, specifically as applied to sexuality, is a scholarly biblical account. For example, when Matthew Vines posited the idea in his famous sermon from a church when he first kind of became popular, and his video went viral of a sermon he gave of why the church should be affirming of homosexual behavior and same-sex marriage, he made a claim that back then they didn't know about loving committed sexual relationships. Well, that's one of the things Richard Hayes takes apart in his vision about sexuality and ethics. In other words, this is a 180 that Hayes is making, and it is not based at all on the biblical text. It's based on some claim of inclusivity, that the gospel is fundamentally about inclusivity and that God is learning and expanding. It assumes incredible things about God. It assumes that the text is not authoritative over Christian ethics, that the cultural mood now actually has more authority because we've got to rethink biblical ethics or set them aside. In fact, he even admits, as I've seen him comment on this book, that his understanding of the text remains the same. I mean, it's just really a stunning thing. And I guess at the end of the day, many of us who were really looking for, helpful biblical exegesis on some of these topics. And obviously Robert Gagnon has been one of the, I think, prominent voices that has done this as well. But you can't pigeonhole Richard Hayes as kind of a fundamentalist or as kind of a, whatever, that the way that I think Robert Gagnon has been wrongly pigeonholed by some. Like, oh, we already know where he's coming down because he's a conservative or whatever. I mean, Richard Hayes is at Duke University. He's at Duke Divinity School. So it's really a really interesting, but also shocking development.
I think one of the main errors is conflating identity again with behavior and with specifically sexual behavior, because the suggestion that God's mercy would widen to include more people if we were affirming of same-sex behavior is to suggest that his mercy is not already wide enough for them. It's the same thing as saying gay people couldn't get married until 2014 in this country. They absolutely could. They, just like everybody else, could only marry people of the opposite sex because that's what marriage is. And these people, everyone is already invited to the table here under God's covenant with us. It's a matter of what we're called to do once we get there. I think that's up for debate. So this was a strange place to take it. But what do you think it is about sex that it is such a stumbling block for people in not just same-sex behavior, but even, last week we talked about the unique violence of sexual violence against both women and men, but women especially. There's something about sex that is different. And I think this is another example where we see that playing out. What is it about it?
I think that's a great point. I think it points to something that's true about sex and something that's not true about sex. What it points to that's true about sex is that sex is an inextricable part of what it means to be human. And I mean that sex both in terms of identity and in terms of behavior. And scripture talks about both of those things, right? So before we meet Eve, we know her name. We know that to be made in the image of God is to be made in the image of God, either male or female. That's in Genesis 1. This is before whatever is not good in God's creation that he points out in Genesis 2 is fixed by God when he creates, his image now in a slightly, different way, creating Eve. And Paul actually talks about this. We mentioned this, I think last week as well, where Paul says something really interesting where, if you sin, you sin. If you sin sexually, you actually sin against yourself. It's, St. Augustine had this Latin, concept that he put forth, incurvatus sin, which is basically sin curves in on itself. It basically becomes a self-destructive act. And there's no greater example of that than actually sexuality, because when you take sexuality outside of its life-giving, God-given purpose and design, it then becomes a force of destruction rather than a force of life. But the thing that it points to that's not true about sex is the cultural replacement of sexual autonomy with human dignity. So, Lewis talks about when you take something that's a secondary purpose and make it a primary purpose, you mess everything up. Sexuality is an inherent part of who we are, but it's not the primary purpose of who we are. Our sexuality is to serve our image bearing. Image bearing is what it means to be fundamentally human. There's something in our value that's established, whether or not we can, have full kind of sexual expression or sexual autonomy or anything like that. But when you untether that sort of value and fundamental identity from God, which is, how God made us, you have to tether it to something else. And sexuality has been that. So now everything gets rethought. It's not like some of these sexual deviancies did not exist in other times and other places, but you had to actually argue that they weren't deviancies. You actually had to say that these aren't norms, What we're doing now is kind of redefining everything from law to theology to clear readings of the biblical text to church history to everything else. And I've said this for a long time. For some reason, when it comes to sex, all the rules get thrown out and we have to reimagine everything. And this is an example of that. And when you see it happen, I remember there was another time this happened. Again, somebody else who had written a book on ethics, a Southern Baptist ethicist, definitely somebody who has moved left politically, but a guy named Dave Gushee. And Gushee had written, some profound things on sexual ethics in his ethical work, Ethics in the Kingdom of God, I think it was called. He co-authored it with it used to be right here around me wherever I'm, but I don't see it right now. But Kingdom Ethics, I think is what it's called. There we go. He had a family member come out as lesbian, and suddenly it's like we're rewriting the whole thing. We're rewriting what we think about ethics. We're rewriting what we think about marriage, what we think about parenting, everything else. And to hold those lines in a world where everything's being reimagined is going to be a real challenge going forward. We talked about how the legalization of same-sex marriage was a push off a slope that has proven to be quite slippery. And to actually stop and go, no, we should have never done that back in 2015 to begin with, requires a commitment that's harder and harder to hold on to today.
Yeah. Makes me think again of that story from Rosaria Butterfield, who notoriously left a gay relationship and years of advocacy for so-called LGBTQ rights or whatever. And she talks about when she first started going to church, one day she went just kind of with a chip on her shoulder. And she said, I was ready to ask people, what did you have to give up to be here? Because you're asking me to give up, my wife and this, my career. She was teaching feminist studies or gender studies, I think, at a university. What do you have to give up? And the first family she met was a family who'd lost a child. And she was like, okay. And, even reading this from the Hays, I'm thinking, why is it you never see, sudden defenses of like, parents who've lost their children to violence should really have the right to exact violence on the perpetrator because it hurts that bad. There's all kinds of other areas of life that are deeply, chaotically painful that we're not seeing the same kind of arguments for, a departure from scripture to justify behavior that would feel right and good in that instance. It's just sex. Is there a reason for that? I mean, well, I guess you just told us the reason for that. I mean, there's just there's something uniquely profound about it. I think there's something spiritual and profound about it.
Well, when I speak to students, I often try to help them make sense of how dramatic the shift has been in the sexual revolution. I think and I'll speak about this next week on a college campus, that the sexual revolution has been successful as a social revolution in ways that really are unparalleled. It's kind of hard even to look at kind of dramatic political revolutions or, other things and say that it's been this thorough. In other words, thoroughly remaking so many different aspects of society and kind of flipping upside down things that were given up until, yesterday. And, I do think that's really the case. And it's just all so normal now, right? It's also normal to think about sex outside of the context of marriage and marriage without any sort of kind of expectations of procreation. And even now increasingly, having a child outside the sexual process without thinking about it twice, as if, well, maybe we should at least give this some thought. In other words, the ends doesn't justify the means here. These are things that are so firmly embedded into the post kind of sexual revolution world that it's just really hard to rethink them if you don't have really solid ground to stand on. And, this week, we had a commentary talking about the anniversary of Theology of the Body, which is John Paul II's, articulation through a set of sermons of what it means to be made in the image of God, male and female, to be embodied souls and to be sexed embodied souls. And the implications are huge. And if you've, kind of spent all your time theologically, I think this is one of the things that Protestants struggle with, and I am one of those, is not giving full reflection to that, but giving full reflection to, being anti-evolution, which I am, right? I think Darwinism is to blame for all kinds of stuff. But it's not just enough to say Darwinism is wrong. We have to also then turn around and say, well, how does the Bible describe us as human beings? And what are the implications of that? And that's a kind of a doctrine of creation that hasn't been given anywhere near the attention it needs in order to ground us for the crazy ways we've rethought what it means to be human. And we're super creative. I mean, listen, the modern Western world has been unbelievably creative at reimagining what it means to be
That's
human.
so true. We're not good at writing movies or novels anymore, but we are really good.
We can flat out do that, can't we?
Yeah.
Unbelievable. Yeah. Yeah. Like our music is really suspect, but my goodness, this is something we can do.
Yeah. John, this has also been a weird couple of weeks with regards to the status of free speech and religious expression and religious freedom internationally. There have been a lot of stories that have felt like they're coming one after the other. Of course, a lot of us have heard about these news of people being arrested in the UK who either protested or posted online about the protests that were sort of anti-immigrant. The founder and owner of Telegram, which is a social media messaging app similar to WhatsApp, was arrested in France this past week for allegedly not moderating content on his platform that people said could be insulting. Now, there were some that indictment is a little bit more nuanced because he's also charged with not clamping down on pornography that was, and specifically child pornography that was being sent over his platform. But he's not being charged with sending it himself. So there's just some speech implications there. And then, of course, there's the case out of Brazil where the Brazilian Supreme Court told Elon Musk that he had to shut down certain dissenters of the government there because they were, quote unquote, spreading misinformation on X. He refused to do that. And now X is completely shut off as of today in Brazil. I was reading another story the other day about the situation in Nicaragua, which has been growing more and more authoritarian over the past several years. The president there recently shutting down 15,000 nonprofits, most of them churches, or revoking their tax-exempt status. So now there's a tax on all tithes in churches there. Some of this has been a direct clampdown on Catholicism, which is the majority religion in Nicaragua, but it's also extending to other churches and Protestant organizations as well. It's been a mixed bag of reactions in the West to a lot of this, especially with regards to the laws in the UK, the public order law that's often invoked in these cases, arresting people for what they've posted online. Some people in the West seem to, I think, reasonably be shocked by this. I think there's a little bit of a misunderstanding about the differences between the way we treat free speech here in the US and the way the European Union, for example, treats free speech. And then there have also been plenty of people in the West who think this is really good and that the US actually should go more in this direction of policing online speech because it's just too dangerous when people say something that's not true. So where do you fall on this whole thing?
Well, this is one of those. There's a handful of people that I've just loved and respected over the years. Chuck Colson, obviously, being one of them. And, I remember like back in the day, there was a time where I was like, I don't know if Chuck's right on this. And dang it, he's right after all, And there's so many people like this. And Oz Guinness is one of those also for me. I love Oz. I consider him a friend and a mentor. And, when we were talking through this offline, I just kept thinking of his line, you know what? Winning freedom. It's always cool when it happens, but it's not, all that remarkable. It's happened more commonly throughout human history. Maintaining freedom, that almost never happens. And, when you talk about the fragile state of freedom in other parts of the world, and for example, in the what was called the developing world up until, recently, as they're trying to put together, social safety nets, and they're trying to put together a civil society and, that sort of stuff. These things are fragile as is and highly volatile. And we've seen, nations go from one extreme to the other in a hurry. But even in the Western world, we take these things for granted, like they can't go anywhere. And then we turn around and look at Britain, where people are being arrested for Facebook posts and where people are being, literally being arrested for thought crimes, things they don't ever say out loud, just being outside an abortion clinic and admitting to praying. it's really a remarkable thing. And it reminds me just how true it is of that observation from Oz, that winning freedom is not all that remarkable in human history, but maintaining freedom is. And freedom is something that has to be preserved and protected. And it doesn't automatically go on forever. The other thing it makes me think of is just that you have to define freedom well, because a lot of times it is expressions of freedom that undermine freedom. It's basically looking to the state and saying, you have to guarantee my right not to be offended. That ends up stealing away this freedom. And that, for example, freedom of speech, that's actually a really weird and bizarre thing in the history of the world, particularly when there is a powerful government, because that has to include the right and the ability to speak out against those in power. I don't know if you knew that, but people in power don't like usually that to happen. And so it becomes a really fragile and vulnerable state. And I say all that in light of even just recently, a handful of people talking about just how great it is in the United States when it comes to freedom of religion. Freedom of religion has never been more protected, we hear. And freedom of religion has never been, more robustly, defined. There's never been more elbow room. And in some ways that's correct, because there have been litigated decisions made articulating like, look, you're you're a university official. You can't infringe on a student's right to think and believe and to act and to speak this way. That's part of this. Or, you're a state actor. You can't tell a local business to do X, Y, and Z. And you certainly can't then have a program that you can't participate in only if you're religious. So these things have been actually decided, and there have been some clarity brought to those edges, but it's constantly being challenged. And the moment that the challenges are not met, then that's when this stuff starts to get really, really, really fragile. And then on top of that, you have to go back to whether freedom itself has a shape and an order and a design, or whether freedom actually means free for all. The moment freedom means free for all, and there's no limits to freedom, and there's no design and an end towards freedom, then it becomes really vulnerable, because it's basically whosever interest serves, whosever interest needs to be served. And that then becomes something that's decided by power in the state's best interest. Another way to say that is, are freedoms given by the state, or are freedoms given by God and to be protected by the state? Because if freedoms are given by the state, then they get to decide what those limits are and what it means to sustain those. And don't think for a second that governments won't throw out little carrots of personal freedom in order to take away larger freedoms. That's exactly what we see over and over and over again. Freedom is this really vulnerable thing. And it's important to talk about, not only because of the number of things that you mentioned, like how many anecdotes there are. And we didn't even mention the super bad ones, North Korea and Myanmar and some of these other places. But, there is a growing movement among elites in the West, including in the United States, to question the good of freedom. Not only to question whether or not freedom is vulnerable, but was this the New York Times, I think, last week, about maybe the Constitution's bad for us? Did you see that piece?
Yeah. Maybe it was a mistake.
Yeah, maybe it was a mistake. Freedom of speech is not a good thing, we hear. And we've heard elected officials make that claim, right? That it's not just, this shouldn't count as freedom of speech, but that freedom of speech itself ain't all it was cracked up to be. And the same thing, religious freedom is code words for bigotry. We've heard undermining of what it actually means. So it's going to be really hard to sustain it in that environment.
Tim Walz said this week something like, there's no constitutional protection of misinformation. There absolutely is constitutional protection. But I heard Matt Taibbi, the journalist, say something on a podcast this week, a lot like what you just said, which is that one of the fundamental differences between the way America comes to free speech and the European Union does is that in our founding documents, we talk about the freedom of speech and expression being inherent and inalienable. It's not granted to us by the government, that the government shall make no law to infringe upon it. The European Union very much views the freedom of speech as a right granted by the government, and he that giveth can taketh away, or at least define it, which is, I think, why you're seeing some of these stark differences. But one of the interesting parts of this story, I think, too, is that wherever you see crackdowns like this on speech, but also on expression, or on challenging the government, you will often see, like we're seeing in Nicaragua and certainly other places, a specific targeting of churches, of Christians. And I think that that is a blessing and a curse. I think that should be a little bit of a feather in our cap, because churches should be the hardest to sway when you're trying to assert state power or become an authoritarian. The churches should be the last bastion, that's standing up to that. Also, the churches should be the hardest to convince, because they shouldn't be convincible. You can convince the markets with money. You should not be able to convince the church with money or with status or anything like that. Do you think the church as an institution in the U.S. right now has the backbone to stand up to this kind of thing? And do you think that our leaders are wary of the church, or as wary as you'd hope they would be?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, obviously, there's a whole lot of things being talked about and written right now about that. And I think you have great examples in which the answer to that is unequivocally yes, and great examples when it's unequivocally, no. And you're seeing some trend lines, as far as that goes, based on kind of whether or not people are willing to take the kind of cultural heat first. Mm-hmm. Is it really indicative of what we will find when it comes to, heat from the state or political heat? And, I think that's more rare. I think you're getting, kind of more heat, obviously, from culture than anywhere else. But if that's a bellwether, an indicator at any level, then it's like, oh, well, the last example we have had to do with, COVID mandates and COVID lockdowns and the church being deemed non-essential. And I think a lot of churches initially were willing to go along with that until they looked around and said, wait a minute, if we're non-essential, why are the casinos and strip clubs essential? Right? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. And those that were basically recognized that and saw that and still were trying to take steps, to do the best that they could with the information that they had. I think there was a lot of those, but then there were others that, had already decided that the church was non-essential. And we've said that a number of times here that, the average person who claims to be a Christian treats the church often as being non-essential. And so we shouldn't do that. It's too important. I think it also has to do with, whether Christianity is seen as the account of reality that's actually true or an account of reality that's personally helpful. Those aren't the same things. If you're thinking of faith in a therapeutic or even a moralistic sense, that's different than thinking about it as a description of reality itself, and therefore God being the one to whom we're ultimately responsible, not the state. But this is not a new conversation, and most of the time throughout Christian history, when this conversation has happened, the stakes had been even higher than they are now. I mean, this is persecution. This is execution. We're thinking about our church, the church fathers, the martyrs, thinking about, if you've never read the book Silence, I know there was a film about it as well, but about Japan and this decision about who do you serve and how do you love your neighbor and also love God, and what does it mean to balance those two? Just a remarkable novel that wrestled with a very real time in history where that decision was being made. And, we haven't had to really wrestle with that at the same degree. We certainly aren't right now, at the same level, but you can kind of see the possibility from here, and you can certainly see it other places. But I think at the end of the day, one of the reasons that these conflicts on these fundamental freedoms happen to come up between the church and the state is that the church is the largest competitor to the state for allegiance. And it's, what are we what are we swearing our allegiance to? Are we swearing it to another Lord, another God, or are we swearing it to something that, context that we're supposed to steward? And that hasn't always been clear.
John, in the first segment, you talked about the success, so to speak, of the sexual revolution and really changing from top to bottom the way we conceptualize ourselves and sex and marriage. And I think all of these new initiatives in several states now across the country with regards to enshrining the so-called right to abortion in state constitutions is evidence of that. So Of course, my state passed that amendment last year. Your state is considering one right now. So is Nebraska. So is Florida. And that's been an interesting case because former President Trump, who has in the recent weeks made some concessions about abortion policy, saying that he would not support any sort of national or federal law regarding restrictions on abortion because it should be a state's issue. He's now talked about offering to pay for IVF services for families, but he did come out and say he feels that this amendment in Florida goes too far. This is an amendment like all the other states that it basically puts abortion as a protected right in the state constitution. That this has caused some clashes among people that we've typically seen on the same sides of this issue in the past. So, for example, Lila Rose, who runs Live Action, came out very strongly against President Trump's statements about, refusing to restrict abortion at the federal level. But then, of course, is supportive of his, not supporting this law in Florida. But then people have pushed back on Lila Rose. It's just been kind of a mess. People are all over the place on this. What does this tell you about the state of the pro-life movement right now in the U.S.?
That we're in a defining moment. I really do think we are. There's been so many developments about this, and we didn't even mention here the new platform position that was kind of invented a couple of weeks ago, where President Trump and J.D. Vance now have both repeated that they want to basically cover IVF and cover IVF in health insurance plans. And we're all old enough to remember in 2008 where folks sued HHS for trying to force healthcare coverage of things that they believe to be a violation of human rights and also the right to life. And the IVF issue is very, very controversial. And it's one thing to say, look, I support it because of what it can be. It's another thing essentially to say, and now everyone's going to pay for it and you can't turn it down. I mean, that's a whole different sort of category, especially when you remember that more embryos lose their lives on a yearly basis because of IVF than because of Planned Parenthood. And, these are very real issues about what it looks like now to take up the mantle of an issue that's extremely important, that has had incredible political weight in the past years, and where we have found ourselves to have a political ally. And that may not be the case. It's clearly not the case to the degree maybe we assumed it was. And what's it going to be like? There's another chapter in this too that we just have to talk about, which is since 2016, the national elections have not gone well for the GOP. And this election really is in one level. There's going to be a referendum. I don't know if it's going to be legitimately a referendum or it's just going to be read that way. I'm pretty sure it's going to be read that way. And that is going to be whether the problem with the GOP is whether they've been too pro-life or too pro-Trump. Now, it's very clear where, President Trump has come down, which is, I'm not going to be that pro-life, and to be that pro-life is an extremist position. And that's the initial thing that he seemed to say about Florida's current 6-week ban, and then backpedaled and said, no, I'm still going to vote against this amendment that's going to enshrine abortion into the Constitution of the state. I think that's really helpful, that he actually backed off of that, and basically said he's going to vote against this, because what's being voted on in Florida, like all of them, are really extremists. I mean, they're basically putting into the state constitution a return, to Roe. And of course, many of them already have had trigger laws or other things that have gone into effect one way or the other, or have really passed to increase access to abortion, for women. So we really do have a divided nation in a way that hasn't happened since the slavery and post-slavery era in the United States around this issue. And that's why I think this is so critical to look specifically at all the ballot initiatives and to know what the ballot initiative is in your state. But the Florida one really is something. And the reason the Florida one is really something is because there are 1 million more registered voters for the GOP than the Democratic Party in the state of Florida. Now, I'm not saying that the GOP has been perfectly pro-life. They've been the closest for a really long time, and now intentionally has moved away from it. And I think the threshold on this is not 50%, it's 60%. So you got to have 60% of the vote for this thing to pass. And right now, it's hard to tell which way this is going to go. In other words, in a state like Florida, politically, if the outcome is this thing passes, it's worse on the ground in America for the protection of life than we even imagined. It's a big, big statement. Now, I think Floridians that are listening should vote. You need to go check out a set of videos that Scott Klusendorf at Life Training Institute and Apologetics Inc. put together, addressing specifically Amendment 4 there in Florida. But this is something that's going to be a bellwether. I mean, this is a big, big deal if Florida goes down in this way. It's going to say, look, any idea that this, generation is going to be the one, to end abortion was just false promises. It's just not where the people are. People are, as we've said in the past weeks here on this program, thoroughly committed to that third exception, which is whatever my case is. I want to have that get out of jail free card of abortion, and I want to have it there. And I think this is going to really require too for churches in Florida and everywhere. I mean, Nebraska, certainly in Colorado, which I held almost no hope for, but it's going to require churches to get political. And churches don't want to get political. They don't want to get political now, even less than they did the last time around. And it's going to require that they get political on this one in Florida and be really clear on, this law will make a big difference. Look, we know the net result in those states that had trigger laws that heavily restricted or ended abortion for all practical purposes after the Dobbs decision have seen a dramatic decrease in the number of lives lost to abortion. In other words, these laws do actually make a difference. I know somebody else made another argument that Dobbs was actually bad for us. Absolutely not. That's crazy. Dobbs revealed where we were, and there's not a political solution to this problem, but there are political strategies to this problem and to the solution, and we have to employ those. So it's going to, honestly, if there weren't so much at stake, I would just grab the popcorn and watch this, with great interest, because it's going to tell us so much.
What's so weird about that, just real briefly, that position that Dobbs was really bad news or whatever, is this has typically been put forward by people who absolutely detest Donald Trump. And, so you can see where those things coalesce. They don't want to give any credit because that happened under his administration. But people who end up criticizing Dobbs are really the closest to Trump's current position on abortion. It's sort of like you read these pieces and you're like, wow, I guess you're voting for Trump and Vance because that's what it sounds like. But regardless, let's be cynics for a minute and assume that most of these pass and that, the majority of the country ends up enshrining into their constitutions or getting close to, a right to abortion, or they pass these wide reaching laws, and abortion just becomes, we kind of return to life under Roe. What's the pivot for the pro-life community? Is it sex ed? Is it, because even, I know you mentioned churches having to get political. I agree with you. But at the same time, we did some exit polling in Ohio after our amendment passed, and the majority of church-going people voted to enshrine abortion in the state constitution. And we recruited tons of churches to talk about it with their people, and it didn't move the needle.
Well, you're pointing to a number of issues. I mean, one is again, going back to the water we swim in and the cultural moment we're in, which is one that has enshrined sexual autonomy. I mean, at the end of the day, there's not a bigger factor in this whole issue than this. It's not like we don't know what the unborn are, right? It's not like we haven't seen in the womb. It's not like we don't have the best technology ever before in all of human history to understand both gestational development and fertility and, how this whole science works. Like, we're more clear on the science to the point that even pro-abortion forces admit it than ever before. So it's not a lack of information. Is it a lack of education? Maybe in some cases where people don't really want to know, they don't really want to step out, maybe. But I just think there's a deep commitment to sexual autonomy and sexual relativism, and it just that's going to have to be dealt with. Now, I think there's a little bit of other things as well, like guilt. My wife just this week interviewed a woman who had made the decision to have 2 abortions. And this will be an episode that airs in the future on the Strong Women podcast. And the forgiveness and the way forward that she found in the church was absolutely remarkable. But churches that never talk about abortion never talk about how to find forgiveness and peace on the other side of it. And, that's the thing about churches that choose not to talk about sin in general or specific sin, is that then you're kind of robbing individuals of that opportunity of forgiveness. And that's what the gospel really is all about, forgiveness, being made right with God, and then right with yourself and right with others. So I think the forgiveness piece is going to be huge. I think the restoration and the reconciliation piece is going to be huge going forward. Complicating all that, listen, we talked about Florida. What's this mean for Florida? If the Colorado thing passes, then what it does is it lays groundwork for the state to come after pro-lifers. I do think we will see the state come after pro-lifers. If we obviously have one presidential candidate that has a track record of doing that in California, going after pro-lifers. Mm-hmm. So I do think we're seeing that in Massachusetts. We're seeing that in Michigan, like talk of it. You're seeing that in Colorado, where you're not allowed to basically state your pro-life convictions in certain ways. If you're a doctor, for example, and do an abortion pill reversal, these are like the deaths by 1,000 cuts. And I think that groundwork will be laid in those states. And so then it'll have to be a matter of conscience. How much do I believe this? Am I willing to go to jail for this? Am I willing to be fired for this? Am I willing to lose my pension and my retirement? So this is so much more than just being kind of like, this is where I think the President Trump is absolutely wrong when he's like, well, everybody just wanted it returned to the states. No, everybody wanted, first of all, not everybody did, but yes, we definitely wanted Roe gone. We thought Roe was poisonous and all that sort of stuff, but not so that each state could just make up its mind whether or not to restrict abortion or whether or not to criminalize pro-lifers. I mean, we didn't want to give them a menu of options like that. Like that never was the plan. It's just been such an up and down moment where I remember, 5, 6, 7 years ago, it was just like, we're in this for the fight for our lives, and we don't have really a future as pro-lifers. We're going to have to just put our heads down. But we never thought at that point that there was going to be the potential of being penalized or criminalized for being a pro-lifer, at least in the same way. And then, hit this high with Dobbs and things seemed to change. But there was a misunderstanding, a misestimation of where the American public is. A lot more to say, but that's kind of, I think you need to know, the punchline here is you got to know whether there's an initiative in your state. And we have to go back and recatechize the church first on this. Because, to your point about exit polling, we're not where we thought we were.
John, this week, Tucker Carlson, former Fox News anchor, who now has one of the biggest, I think, conservative podcasts in the country, interviewed a guy I'd never heard of before, Darryl Cooper. He's a historian. They talked at length about World War II, and he made some really, really fascinating, which is a light way of putting it, comments. He suggested that, for example, Winston Churchill was kind of a bad actor in World War II. He assigned Hitler some sort of pragmatic problem-solving, motives with regards to the death camps. It was really kind of hard to follow. So what exactly happened here? Is this a scandal that's worth talking about?
Well, almost. I mean, it's not like the guy said things that were new. The difference is he said them on Tucker Carlson's program, which obviously has a bigger audience than most of the major news networks. And it was just crazy. It was just fascinating, if not so big that he would be platformed. And Tucker Carlson actually went on to endorse him as a historian, like least well known, but one of the most honest. And, look, we don't have time to really get into the ins and outs of what he claimed, but the big part of it was that Churchill was the real villain of the Second World War, and that Adolf Hitler was really put into a corner, and that he wanted peace over and over and over again. And Churchill kept pushing him and pushing him and pushing him. And that includes kind of, ending in this position where they had no choice but to deal with all the POWs by launching this thing called the Holocaust. Now, to be clear, the guy did turn around and say, Hitler's not blameless and he is guilty and all that sort of stuff. But it was a way of justifying some of the worst atrocities. And then on a Twitter thread afterwards, he kind of doubled down on those claims. I mean, it was just really something. Now, what is there to say? The specifics on this are not historically up in the air, of the evil that was done by the Nazis, the Third Reich, led by Adolf Hitler, who had written about what he wanted to do and continuously talked about what he wanted to do and then did what he said he wanted to do over and over and over. Like that stuff is not up for grabs. The fact that Hitler made certain promises and overtures of peace that he didn't mean and then turned around and undermined it, that stuff's all historically verifiable. So the selective use of data to prove the thesis is troubling. The fact that it was done on such a big outlet is even more troubling. And that points to something that we were talking about this in the editorial meeting, and Tim and Shane, two of our colleagues, I think we're really kind of wrestling with this well. Just this, this kind of conspiratorial, somebody's hiding something from me and there's a way to get behind the narrative, you know? And the problem with that is the fact that there's so much truth to this dominant narrative that's always being given to us and sold to us. And it creates this, again, crisis of trust. But what ends up happening then is anybody who promises you the inside scoop suddenly becomes a reliable source, even if they're not. And that's really what happened here. It was just really, you know, again, nothing this guy said was actually kind of new, but it just widely, you know, not credited. Now, look, was Churchill a perfect figure? No, and he certainly wasn't. And he pushed back on those details, looking at certain ways that Churchill was morally, guilty of different things as the explanation that Churchill's actually the villain of the entire story. And again, not the case. So, the specifics of this, I think, are pretty thoroughly studied and adjudicated and so on. But I think we need to be careful in our, in this the moment where there's a crisis of trust, to become so cynical that anybody that promises us the inside scoop suddenly becomes a trustworthy source. Mm. It's just really, not the case. And I think also there was a part of this that made me think of our conversation last week, the conversation about ideology versus worldview, right? And that when you kind of superimpose an ideology, and an ideology tends to divide people who believe in the ideology are good, people who don't as bad. We're the good ones, they're the bad ones. That's one of the features of ideology, rather than kind of what's true about the human condition to break the world up into the ones who are the problems and ones who are the good guys. And then all the data has to be reinterpreted. And we're seeing that in the way both ideologues on all sides, and I mean the far left and the far right, are talking about historical facts. And this is an example of that this week. So it was troubling. I honestly wouldn't spend a whole lot of time, talking about this normally if it wasn't so loud, even today on social media. It's kind of like the headline here. And, for everyone to know, in case anything crazy happens the next 2 days, we're having this conversation on Wednesday, which is a little bit earlier than normal. But I think it is an example of that, kind of the difference between ideology and worldview, another way of drawing that distinction.
Here's a good one, just pulling the whole conversation we've had today together. Should denying the Holocaust, now that's not what this person was doing, but should denying the Holocaust be illegal? Because it is illegal in, I think, Germany and Poland. It might be illegal in France. So should it be? Is that a good thing? You've got, 30 seconds. Let's hear it.
In 30 seconds, let me address that one. I mean, look, there is limits to freedoms. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater is the famous example. Why? Because of these ideas and the harm that they create. It gets more difficult when it's harder to tabulate the immediate harm factor. And I think, when you're coming out of World War II, the danger and the harm of denying the Holocaust is immediate and obvious and clear. Should it be protected in that sense as being irrefutable? Absolutely not. And that's the other thing is sometimes the way we think about speech and our misunderstanding of freedom is that you can't actually refute it. Free speech means you can say it, and then it's fair game and people can beat it up. And I do think that by and large, if we're looking to the state to be the arbiter of what's true, again, the state's job is to protect the rights, and to guarantee the rights, not to make the rights. They're not the source of the rights. And I think that we need to keep this space created for absolute refutation. That's what's so crazy about so many of the compromises of speech in the West, in America in particular, that you're just not allowed to say, oh, this is actually wrong. You know what? Boys don't menstruate, and suddenly you're accused of hate. No, we can actually have this as a scientific debate. It's crazy that we have to do it. It says a lot about the sort of world we live in, that we're actually having this conversation, but we need to have this conversation.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the context of it.
I like it. Okay. Well, John, that is all the time we have for the program today. Let's talk about recommendations before we sign off here. Do you want to go first?
Yeah. I think, given the history this week, the anniversary of the beginning of the theology of the body, again, I'm Protestant, for various theological, convictions, but this was a very, very important contribution, I think, that, JP2 made to Christian thought and morality. And it's pushed Protestants to think more in terms of kind of the historic commitment that the church has had against Gnosticism, that, our bodies actually matter and our bodies actually tell us something about God, about how he made us, but also about God himself, because God is revealed in what he's made. He made our bodies. And so I guess to that note, check out the work of Christopher West, who's done, I think, a wonderful job of helping us all think about the significance of the body as a grounding, specifically for sexual ethics. By the way, the next chapter of this is getting serious about the body as a grounding for ethics when it comes to technology and artificial intelligence and all the other things. So there's more ground to be covered here than just sexual ethics. But, that's where he started because it was such a big deal at the time. And I think that's a good place to start. The book, so I'll give you the specific book, which is Our Bodies Tell God's Story. And even the title itself, to me, was a really profound thing to say, which is our bodies tell God's story. In other words, we think about God revealing himself in the Word and in the world. We forget that we were created in his image. That's obviously a statement of revelation, like, oh, humans point to God, but then how do our bodies reveal God? Especially when you're talking about God who doesn't have a body. That's fascinating. And it's really theologically rich.
Yeah, so helpful. Well, I'm going to recommend this coming week. So on Tuesday, which is September 10th, I'm going to be moderating a panel in Cleveland with Jews for Jesus about, they're calling it United Voices Against Anti-Semitism. So there are going to be some Christian thinkers and professors. Gerald McDermott is going to be there, and some Jewish people as well. There is a girl coming who's going to be on the panel who I met last week and who is just a really impressive person. She runs a chapter of an organization called Zikaron Basalon. And this is in Israel, but I thought of this in the last segment today because what they do is they bring Holocaust survivors around to different communities and have them share their story, but they do it in a really intentionally small way. So they don't have big events. It's not at big venues. They literally bring people into their living rooms. That's Basalon is a nod to that. And so it's small, but the idea is, especially, as Holocaust denialism is a thing, and as every year we lose more and more survivors, it is critically important that people tell their stories to the next generation. And it makes, that much more of an exponential impact when you hear it from somebody personally who personally was there. So it's such a cool organization, but she's going to be on this panel as well. And the topic is basically, how can Christians and Jewish people and the church work to combat anti-Semitism, not just in the US, but globally? What's the history of anti-Semitism? What does the Bible have to say about it? So I'm really, really excited just to be a small part of the conversation. So this is going to be at Corporate College East, which is in Cleveland. It's on September 10th, next Tuesday from 7 to 9 p.m. It's free, but please RSVP if you can. Just Google United Voices Against Anti-Semitism and you'll find it there, so that they know to expect you. But I'm really looking forward to it. So if you come, please also come and say hello. I'm just moderating a panel discussion after the main speakers share their insight, but I think it's going to be a great event. So that's my recommendation. Otherwise, thanks so much for listening to Breakpoint this week. From the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, I'm Maria Baer, alongside John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center. As always, please direct your questions and criticisms to John's email, and please direct your praise and compliments to my email. And you can find links to all the stories we talked about this week, as well as other commentaries and resources at breakpoint.org. Otherwise, we'll see you all back here next week. God bless.